Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Daniel Marx, and I am an environmental attorney with the law firm of Flaherty Hood. And today we are here for presentation on the implementation standards, the impact that will have on permittees throughout the state of Minnesota. We'll also be doing a little bit of a conversation about some other regulatory issues at the state and federal level. The impact that will have on permittees throughout the state of Minnesota. We'll also be doing a little bit of a conversation about some other regulatory issues at the state and federal level. The impact that will have on permittees throughout the state of Minnesota. We'll also be doing a little bit of a conversation about some other regulatory issues at the state and federal level. The impact that will have on permittees. So excuse if there's any technical glitches here. So with us today, like I said, I work both with the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities, which has historically a robust environmental program focused on legislative and legal advocacy. I also work with the Minnesota Environmental Science and Economic Review Board, or MESERB, which is a joint powers organization made up of about 42 city sanitary districts and public utility commissions in Greater Minnesota. And this presentation is brought to you today, the joint effort of the CGMC and MESERB. Joining us this morning is John Hall from Hall & Associates. He is an environmental attorney and also environmental engineer who has 30 years of experience working on Clean Water Act permitting issues, focusing on municipal issues, and he has worked at the EPA in the past, and he is an expert, a national expert that both MESERB and the CGMC have used for the last 20 years or so.
And good morning, everyone. It's certainly a pleasure to be back in Minnesota. I enjoyed working here over the last few decades, and working in general very cooperatively with the PCA and the local communities to try to produce real environmental benefits for the expenditures that you're making. And that's what we'll be focusing on today with regard to the new standards and implementation.
And now, after this brief introduction, we are going to transition away from our faces and move into a PowerPoint presentation. So give me a moment to make a transition here. Okay, so today what we're going to talk about, we're going to give a kind of a brief regulatory update, state and federal regulatory matters. We're going to talk about kind of the background on these river eutrophication standards, or the new phosphorus standards for rivers and streams in Minnesota, which we will affectionately refer to as the RES. And then we're going to break down what we perceive to be many of the problems with the RES, including some flawed scientific issues, an illegal implementation mechanism that the PCA is using. And we ask the question, is the RES going to help achieve water quality standards? And then we talk about the solution to some of the problems that we talk about. And as the presentation goes forward today, we would like you to ask questions. And so if you have questions, please email them to cgmc_communications@flaherty-hood.com, and we will answer your questions at the end of the presentation. So again, I just want to touch base quickly and just talk about what the CGMC and MESERB do on environmental issues. And both of the organizations focus on advocating for water quality standards that are reasonable, scientifically sound, and cost effective. Our goal is really to work to ensure that the limited resources that are available to address clean water issues are used most effectively. The CGMC focuses on legislative and legal advocacy, and then it does some regulatory work. MESERB, on the other hand, is really a technical organization made up of wastewater professionals and engineers. We really work on proactive engagement with the MPCA at the MPCA level, working on technical development and the implementation of standards. And we're both of the organizations are made up of Greater Minnesota municipal entities. So today we're going to talk initially brief regulatory update and what we refer to as the regulatory tsunami, which is an onslaught of current and incoming regulations at the state and federal level that are going to have significant cost impacts for municipalities. On the state level, and John will talk a little bit about some of this as well on the state and federal levels, but we have a new anti-degradation standard, which is really a water quality standard that governs future growth and will have tremendous impact on Greater Minnesota going forward. We have the new phosphorus standards for lakes, which has been around for a while, but then the new standards for rivers, which we are going to spend a significant amount of time talking about today. The PCA is in the development stages of a wild rice sulfate standard, which the most recent estimate by the PCA indicates that it will likely impact around 50 municipalities in the state. And we do have a list of who those municipalities are. So if you would like that, you can contact us and we can get that to you. There's also a chloride standard, which is currently on the books. And there has been a lot of movement back and forth on what to do around this standard. And there is still a lot in play, but it is a significant issue. Both the sulfate and the chloride standard have tremendous cost impacts for Greater Minnesota cities specifically. The PCA is also working on a tiered aquatic life uses standard. And then coming down the pipe is a nitrate standard, which we expect will come within the next 5 years or so at the state and federal level. So now I'm going to have John talk a little bit about some of the federal regulatory tsunami.
Yeah, this is Mr. Hall. The reason we're talking about these other regulatory requirements is because the phosphorus issues that we're facing today are just a really small part of the overall regulatory mandates that you'll be facing in the near future. So to get a more complete picture, this helps you to understand where your dollars may be expended and at great cost, and then the closer look as to whether or not these kind of requirements are reasonable. At the federal level, EPA recently announced that they want nutrient reduction in all waters, and that they do not even need to demonstrate cause and effect as necessary. Now, just as a minor point, the Clean Water Act is on it, in essence, a cause and effect statute. If you're causing a pollutant impact and it's adversely affecting uses, you're supposed to correct it. What EPA's announcements have now done is told the regional offices in delegated states, you don't even need to show that nutrients are causing an adverse effect. I just want you to force communities and industries to lower them. That we think is a distinctly illegal activity. On wet weather issues and collection systems, this, as we know, has been an issue for a number of cities throughout the country, and certainly in Minnesota also. EPA has got what I call the zero overflow policy, and where they're insisting that your collection systems be designed to operate flawlessly. There is no such requirement in the Clean Water Act, and in fact, engineers cannot actually engineer a system to operate flawlessly. There's always flood conditions and other factors that you can't control, and these are the types of things that EPA has been refusing to recognize in the appropriate design of collection system improvements. They have also been related to wet weather flows, banning an option known as blending, which had been used for decades by municipal facilities to process greater wet weather flows during high rainfall events. And the Iowa League of Cities case in 2013 ruled that EPA's ban was illegal and beyond their authority under the Clean Water Act. Nonetheless, the agency has been telling all delegated states and regional offices outside of the 8th Circuit area that you still have to use a blending prohibition, yet another illegal mandate. There are concerns and problems ongoing with regulation of copper and aluminum. Copper is largely non-toxic in a municipal effluent because it's complex, and aluminum is the 4th most common element on the planet. The agency many years ago established an extremely low aluminum criteria that many states are still using. The criteria is 30 years out of date, and is forcing many communities to go into non-compliance. And this is particularly a problem for communities that are trying to reduce phosphorus levels using alum as a basis for coagulating and dropping out the phosphorus. When you use alum, obviously you will increase your aluminum discharge. And by trying to meet the phosphorus numbers, you will cause a violation of the aluminum criteria. And again, it's a violation only because the criteria is so out of date and has never been updated. Dan mentioned the anti-degradation rule modification that EPA put in place and the PCA recently reaffirmed. EPA did this in 2015, and they did it under the rubric that they were only putting out a clarification of an existing rule. They, in fact, radically changed the federal rule to put in a new definition of practicable and requiring all cities and industries, if they are expanding, that is, if you're growing, that you must use any practicable alternative to reduce any increased pollutant, meaning even trace pollutants that you never previously regulated. And the definition of practicable means you're capable of engineering a treatment of that pollutant, and you're capable of paying for it. Now, there is no other requirement under the Clean Water Act that is based simply on one can engineer it and you can afford it. Again, this was an illegal expansion of regulatory authority, and one that's going to literally waste $1 trillion nationwide. EPA has also recently announced they want flow limitations in NPDES permits. They are doing this in the regions where the agency issues the permits, and they've informed delegated states that they want flow limits. They are also putting flow limits in MS4 permits. And again, flow is not a pollutant, and limiting flow was struck down in a district court, in several district court cases over the years. And despite EPA being repeatedly told you are not allowed to limit flow, they are putting it in permits. Related to this flow limit is also new permitting provisions for stormwater, where EPA is telling the states they need to put in provisions that say no MS4 facility can cause or contribute to a criteria exceedance. That provision will basically put every MS4 permit in the country in violation with no reasonable way to comply. In various TMDLs, and this is key, these are related to nutrient TMDLs, EPA has been mandating runoff levels from both non-point source and point sources to meet pre-European levels. In other words, the criteria that they're picking as the targets that you must meet are ones that you have to depopulate the entire watershed to meet and or eliminate all agricultural operations to meet. They have put out a half dozen TMDLs recently that impose these requirements, and requests to have them do more reasonable approaches have gone unanswered. And last but not least is a requirement that was adopted about 3 years ago, which forces which requires all communities, all NPDES permittees, to use tests that are sufficiently sensitive to show whether or not you comply with all water quality standards. Areas where this is already creating major problems are related to pollutants such as arsenic, which are naturally occurring throughout the Midwest. EPA's arsenic criteria is about 18 parts per trillion. The natural arsenic level in the Midwest is somewhere around a part per billion, or about 50 times higher. And they are now using these test results to mandate that communities implement stringent treatment to reduce arsenic down to part per trillion levels. That, of course, cannot be physically attained. You would have to use things like reverse osmosis to treat the effluent, and in any event, the natural waters in the systems are well above these criteria, so there would be no actual environmental benefit. So this entire range of activities that's going on with the federal government would, if implemented as required by EPA right now, would bankrupt Minnesota communities. And obviously, that's not a reasonable result to occur.
Thank you, John. And so today, we're asking the question, kind of what is at stake? And this regulatory tsunami, both at the state and federal level, is going to impose tremendous costs, especially on greater Minnesota cities and municipal entities. These costs will be in the hundreds of millions of dollars when we're talking about the implementation of the phosphorus standards, but when you compound that with the other regulations that we're discussing, we are talking about billions of dollars. It's going to increase rates around the state. And what we really have to work to ensure is that if we are going to expend limited resources, that it will benefit water. We are not anti-standards, we are not anti-regulation, but we want to make sure that as our municipal entities and as the municipal entities have a responsibility to their ratepayers and their communities to do all sorts of important government services, that when they're spending that money, that we're getting a benefit. And so the goal, like I said, is the efficient allocation of limited clean water resources. And the quote on this screen, which I won't read to you, you can read it, is a great synopsis of what we are about. And today we are going to be laying out, talking about in specific, the implementation of the river eutrophication standards. But I want to make clear, as we have talked about initially here, that this is just the tip of the spear. There are several of these other standards coming, and we're here today to talk to you about getting your support for the CGMC and MESERB to develop strategies over the long term to address these issues, to make sure that as the PCA develops these standards and the EPA develops these standards and implements these standards, that they are, one, developed based upon sound science, which ensures that the resources that need to be invested are effectively tailored to benefit water quality. And on the state and the federal government, to some extent, help pay for the investments that are necessary. And so the CGMC has established an environmental action fund for legal and legislative action and advocacy on these issues, and we are going to ask for your support for the CGMC. And then MESERB does a lot of work on the regulatory side that is essential in kind of proactively addressing these issues as they come up. And we also need you to join MESERB and support our efforts. So now we're going to move on to talking about the specific issue that brings us to the presentation today, which is the river eutrophication standards and their implementation. And I think it's important to note that prior to the adoption of these standards, point sources, municipalities, had reduced their share of phosphorus pollution in the state by more than 70%. And that was through the 1 milligram per liter phosphorus rule and the lake standards. So these river standards were developed to really deal with, from the point source side, about 30% of what is left of the problem. The PCA readily acknowledges that in the state of Minnesota, that non-point sources, so not the cities, are producing 91% of the phosphorus pollution in the state. And so we're dealing with a very small portion of the overall problem by focusing on point sources. These river eutrophication standards are designed to prevent the harmful algal growth that you've read about in many of the recent articles in the Star Tribune and elsewhere. They're based on the assumption that as total phosphorus, or TP, increases, algal levels increase, and that when algal levels increase, it will have negative impacts on the health of the river and aquatic life through dissolved oxygen fluctuation and concentration, or the biochemical oxygen demand. And we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about that. And then another key point about the development of these standards is the law says, and the MPCA presented this to the public as if they were going to implement these standards on average, based on average summer conditions, including flow, average flow conditions. And this is key to this presentation. And so we'll talk about that in more detail. So what are the problems with the res that we have identified? First, and we'll talk about this briefly, there are some fundamental scientific flaws in the conceptual framework in the development of the standards. And then secondly, and this is the focus of today's presentation, is the MPCA is using an illegal implementation strategy which leads to the calculation of permit limits that are more restrictive than necessary to actually meet the water quality standards. So the overarching scientific flaw, and this is something that MESERB members and CGMC members are very familiar with, is that the PCA used two scientifically flawed criteria within these standards to determine whether or not there is a problem in a water body with nutrient pollution. And the most egregious example here is with BOD, or biochemical oxygen demand. The PCA used BOD as kind of a keystone to develop these standards, and then used BOD as a primary response variable to determine whether or not nutrient pollution is having negative impacts.
Yeah, Dan, if I can add
Please.
one thing for a second, just to make sure everybody understands how the RES criteria apply. The criteria are what I call two-part criteria. There are causal parts of the standard, and then there are response parts of the standard. The causal part is phosphorus. So the state goes out to look at the stream and asks the question, is the phosphorus level in the stream on the growing season average above the phosphorus target set in the criteria? If the answer to that question is yes, then they check to see whether or not there's been an adverse response in the stream due to the phosphorus. And as with the lake standards, they used algae because nutrients grow algae. That's the concern that you're looking at. But so they established algae as one measure of adverse response. But then they also included several other parameters, regardless of whether or not the algal level in the stream is high. And the two that are the clearly scientifically flawed ones are BOD and, as Dan will talk about, DO flux. So if you think about it like this, if you go to a stream and you find an elevated phosphorus, even if there's no high algal growth, if they find BOD, they take a sample in the stream and they find BOD is high, higher than their number, or they find DO is fluctuating more than the number they picked, that stream is declared to be nutrient impaired, even if it clearly does not have excessive algal growth, which is, if you will, kind of turns the entire standard on its head. The whole purpose of the standard was to control excessive algal growth, not to control DO fluctuations or BOD levels. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, thank you, John. And so quickly with the BOD test or issue, MESERB made several comments and participated during rulemaking, saying that the use of BOD to develop these standards and then as that response variable was not scientifically appropriate. The standards were then developed, and there were several scientific experts that supported that position. After the standards were developed, the Standard Methods Organization, which if you are in wastewater, you recognize, which is through EPA regulations, the expert on this test, published a memorandum saying that BOD is not considered a scientifically valid measurement of nutrient impacts. So basically the way that the PCA is using it is scientifically flawed. And so that was something that we presented to the PCA after the standards were developed. We've had many meetings with them, and it's something that they have frankly ignored. And so we are now engaging in some lawsuits on that issue, both at the federal and the state level. And with respect to those lawsuits, I won't speak a great deal about them today, but we do have a federal lawsuit challenging the EPA's approval of those standards based upon the use of BOD and DO flux. And we had a state rulemaking petition, which is now pending at the Court of Appeals on this issue.
And let me just make a quick point on DO flux, because I know we didn't want to spend much time on that. The DO flux number that the PCA picked out is a flux level that occurs naturally in the environment. I mean, whether or not you have significant algal growth or not, you can easily get DO fluxes greater than the numbers they picked. EPA itself has already acknowledged that DO flux, or the bounce in DO, does not tell you whether or not you've got an aquatic life impairment. However, the PCA is claiming that whenever you have more DO flux than the number they picked, that means aquatic life is impaired. There is, in fact, not a single scientific document published anywhere that shows DO flux causes impairment on aquatic life. So it's clearly an erroneous application of that parameter. And when you realize that the flux level they picked is actually the naturally occurring one, you know, that just means you'll be predicting all kinds of nutrient impairments in all kinds of streams that have no nutrient impairment whatsoever. And that does need to be changed.
All right, now I want to move on, and if you have questions on those issues, please feel free to contact us. But I want to move on and kind of focus on the illegal implementation that we have seen affecting municipal permittees throughout the state of Minnesota. And the first point in this is that after the standards were adopted, the PCA developed a guidance document for the implementation of these standards. And this guidance document significantly and substantively amended the means in which the PCA was going to implement the standards. So they did something very different than what they said to do.
Far more restrictive, actually.
Far more restrictive. And the PCA can amend its rules and its laws, but to do that, it has to go through a specific process that is established in Minnesota law, the notice and public comment rulemaking, and they need to take comments from the public and go through a specific set of procedural components to do that, and they didn't do that in this case. And the fundamental change here, which is significant, as we'll explain, is that the RES were intended to apply over the long-term summer average conditions. And that makes sense because it's in those summer, September through June, or June through September, where algal growth is the most, has the greatest impact or the greatest probability. And so PCA initially said that it was going to apply over long-term summer average conditions, including summer average flows. But this guidance document changed that. So I want to talk and just present to you the language in the rule. So the rule says this: discharges of total phosphorus must be controlled so that the RES is maintained for the long-term summer concentration of total phosphorus, and then this is key, when averaged over all flows. And it also says RES compliance is based on summer average concentration of the applicable criterion. The SONAR, the document that the PCA used to present this to the public and explain how it would be implemented initially, says that the RES are based on a long-term summer average. All summer days, and thus, and this is key, all summer flows are equally weighted. They said evaluating a single summer river flow to establish effluent limits is not consistent with the definition of average. Seasonal averaging period applies to all summer days over multiple years, so there is not a critical flow. And this is an important point. The PCA said they were not going to use a critical flow to implement these standards. They would use average flow conditions. And finally, they said all available flow data will be considered when establishing effluent limits. Now here is what they are doing. So this is what they said, this is what they are doing. And we think this is an illegal kind of a bait and switch. So they said they were not going to use a critical flow. And the MPCA in its guidance document calls what they're doing the use of a rare critical daily low river flow. So the PCA is using the 80th percentile exceeds flow, and they're assuming that that is the flow for the river. And they are using that in conjunction with a high wastewater treatment flow, the 70% of the average wet weather design flow. And they're using this to calculate the waste load allocations and the ultimate permit limits. And I want to talk a little bit about what this means, and then I'll have John jump in to do a better job explaining the technical issues. But basically, using the 80th percentile exceeds flow for the river artificially inflates both the amount of pollution and the impact of that pollution. So when you use that low river flow and you combine it with a high wastewater treatment flow, it's artificially inflating, the amount of pollution going into the river, and because the river flow is assumed to be low, it's artificially inflating the impact. And the analysis that we have done on permits thus far shows that by using the PCA's 80th percentile flow, the waste load allocations are more restrictive by a factor of 6 or more than if they had used the average flow, which is what the law requires. And then the return frequencies for the flows that have been selected are 10 to 15 years. So this is extremely rare flow conditions for a river. Again, it's supposed to be based on summer average conditions.
Long-term.
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 Summer average conditions. And I don't know how 10 to 15 years can be characterized as average. And then the final point is the probability that the existence of this low river flow, which the PCA assumes, exists simultaneously with that high river flow is virtually impossible.
High wastewater.
High wastewater flow, excuse me, is virtually impossible. As you all understand that when the river flow is low, generally speaking, the wastewater treatment is also going to be low. The flow from the wastewater treatment is also going to be low.
Actually, a number of NPDES permits in the state are written on that principle. Which we had clarified with PCA many years ago, that where you've got a situation where the wastewater plant flows come down along with the river flow, which is quite frankly a typical situation because rainfall influences the amount of flow that comes into a plant, that the PCA will give you a higher effluent concentration to go along with the lower wastewater flow. And in this particular instance, they're doing the exact opposite.
Okay, so John, is there anything else that you want to say on this slide?
I guess the only cap point I would make is the manner in which they've made these changes actually makes the application of these RES standards more restrictive than any other water quality criteria in the state. The other criteria are applied on like 1 in 5 year to 1 in 10 year return flow conditions, toxics, things like that really can cause a significant immediate adverse effect. And this parameter, which is certainly not a toxic and certainly does not cause an immediate and severe adverse effect, they've picked out something that's like on the order of 1 in every 15 years occurrence. So it's just baffling that this could have occurred.
So again, I just want to stop and remind you, if you have questions, please email them in. We're going to shift now to a little bit more of a technical component of the presentation, but again, please email your questions so we can deal with them at the end of the presentation. So now we're going to transition, and John is going to talk about how this is specifically playing out in the Minnesota River Basin as an example.
And and we'll look at a couple of these questions about point of compliance and how they're using current data or not. But let me just show you how this is working in practice. Now, as you know, we just finished talking about this design flow that they chose. This 80th percentile daily flow, daily. Remember, the standard said long-term average, summer growing season. So long-term average condition over a 4-month period. So how does that possibly line up with a daily flow? Well, they presented this analysis for the Minnesota River Basin, and they've got an analysis literally for the entire basin right now that applies their RES under this procedure. And if you look at the top graphic, the Minnesota River near Jordan summer average flows, the red line that you see going across the bottom of the graph, that's what the 80th percentile summer daily dry weather flow is. So that's the number they're using as the dilution that's available in the stream. What we did was we took the period of record from 86 to present and asked the question of, well, what is the actual summer average flow? So, do you have years where in fact you're, and how many of them are actually at this extremely low value that they've picked as depicted by the red line? And you can see the little orange, the orange values are the stream flows, and the vast majority of those conditions, what a shock, are far above the 80th percentile daily low flow. In fact, the average condition in the river is somewhere around 7,000 CFS. And they've picked out a number that I think it's on the order of 1,400 or 1,500 CFS, about a factor of 6 lower. So when you look at the return frequency, if I said to myself, well, as a summer average condition, how often does this 80th percentile flow appear? Well, it's way out there on the far end of the graph in the 13, 14-year return frequency, and that the actual average condition, the one that's a return frequency of every 2 years, that would be an average. That's 7,000 CFS. So for those of you in wastewater allocation parlance, they picked an amount of dilution for your discharge that's 6 to 7 times lower than they should have picked for applying the res. And obviously you'll get a far more restrictive value. Now, if you look at the plant flows that go along with these, we asked the city of Mankato to give us their data so we could plot the river flow versus their effluent flow. And, you know, you can see around 7,000 CFS, the summer average flow for their discharge is about, well, say 7.5 MGD. So that's what it would be on average. But under the low flow condition, there's somewhere around 6.5 to closer to 6 MGD. So you've actually put a flow from the treatment plant. Remember, they picked a wet weather flow to apply into dry weather condition that cannot possibly occur at the same time. So we've gone from a 1 in 14-year condition to, I don't know, a 1 in 100-year condition. Fact of the matter is, I don't think you can't physically have a long-term low flow at the in the river happening with a wet weather flow at the plant. I mean, the two just don't ever happen together. So you can see that just statistically what they did, clearly they've picked a implementation approach that doesn't give you the right available assimilative capacity in the stream. Now, but it actually gets worse. This data is the data that they presented for setting the effluent limits for Minnesota River discharges. The blue line that you see going through the data, this was created by PCA, is how much phosphorus load you're allowed to have in the system to meet the res standard. The little red dots are the data that were collected from 2002 to 2011 in the Minnesota River at Jordan. All right. The first thing you'll notice from this graph is as the flows get lower, you actually are in compliance with the res standard. Remember, you'd look for the average of these little red dots. And when you're below the 70th percentile to the 100th percentile on this flow exceeds graph, that's a dry condition. And that's the condition that actually meets the res. The condition that doesn't meet the res standard, and this should not be a shock to anybody, is the condition where there's greater flow in the river and therefore greater non-point source load inputs. So if you will, the point sources or whatever efforts that have also been done for non-point source control is effective at meeting the standard during the lower flow conditions that the point sources impact. It's not able to meet the standards at the higher flow conditions that the point sources have really no effect on. The other thing you'll notice is the dates. Well, the data that they used to create this chart ignored the fact that the point sources dramatically reduced their phosphorus loads to meet the TMDL that was set for the Minnesota River Basin. In fact, the phosphorus loads have decreased by about 200 to 400 pounds per day over this period of record. Now, I'll go back a slide for a second. So if you're looking at data prior to 2011, it had a higher load coming into the system from point sources. And of course, that load would have more of an effect at the lower flows. If you go back to this chart, all of those red dots should be moved down anywhere from 200 to 400 kilograms. And if you reduce them, then you see virtually all of the flow conditions that are affected by the point sources meet the res load target that the PCA set. Or in other words, there's no basis to regulate point sources more restrictively when you use the updated information for the system. Now, why they did not use updated information is quite frankly beyond me, because the Clean Water Act mandates that NPDES permits and wastewater allocation analyses must reflect current conditions, but they didn't do it. So the summary of the position from just looking at the Minnesota River data, and we're seeing the same situation played out in the other basins where we're looking at their res criteria implementation. They are not using current data. They're not reflecting the money municipalities put into lowering phosphorus. The lower flow conditions, by and large, at least for this system, meet the phosphorus targets. The law requires you to recognize the wastewater improvements, or why would we have done them in the first place? And when you look at the remaining loads, now this is just Minnesota River Basin as an example. That chart, that earlier chart that you looked at, around 7,000 CFS, or meaning the average flow in the system, the kilogram per day level in the system is about 5,000 to almost 6,000 kilograms per day of phosphorus is in the system. The wastewater plants are discharging at or less than 2,000 kilograms per day into the system. Or in other words, 4% of the phosphorus that's remaining in the system is from the point sources. And yet, they're proposing to regulate those sources more restrictively. As you can imagine, there is nothing you could do with point source control that could possibly produce a meaningful change in water quality in the Minnesota River Basin at this point. Even if 4% went to zero, it would not make a measurable change in the system. Now, there are some other obvious problems when you look at the data. I think this is what may have driven the PCA to decide they had to come up with a way of regulating point sources more restrictively, even though the res criteria would not allow them to do it. When you look at the stream flows versus chlorophyll A data in the system, and the chlorophyll A are listed on the left hand, and the stream flows are on the bottom, or on the x-axis. You see that as flows decrease, more algal growth occurs. Now, in a riverine system, this would occur for a number of reasons. The Minnesota River in particular, at low flow conditions, is less turbid, and therefore more light penetrates the water and you grow more algae. Under higher flow conditions, meaning anything above, I'll say 4,000 or 5,000 CFS, the system starts getting quite turbid and you just grow less algae. Matter of fact, the algae don't exceed the water quality criteria when they're averaged together at these higher flow conditions. But remember, it's the higher flow conditions that are bringing in the phosphorus. So remember, the original basis of this criteria was we're regulating phosphorus to produce lower algal growth. But the conditions in the Minnesota River that produce higher phosphorus levels, in fact, produce lower algal growth. And so we plotted the data for the Minnesota River, and it shows the exact opposite of what the PCA assumed would be occurring when they put out the res criteria. At phosphorus levels that are at or below the res criteria, you have the highest algal growth, somewhere around 100 micrograms per liter. At phosphorus levels that are the highest, meaning above 300 micrograms, and there's a fair amount of that when there's substantial non-point source runoff, you get the lowest algal growth. Or in other words, the system is performing exactly the opposite way that the res criteria assumed it would perform. Obviously, simply just claiming you need to reduce more phosphorus in the system to meet the res criteria doesn't do anything. As a matter of fact, when you look at the data sets to see what happens when I meet the res criteria in the Minnesota River Basin, and this is going to play out in the other systems also, by the way, you see that under the lower flow conditions, the phosphorus criteria is met. I mean, 163 micrograms of average phosphorus is, for all practical purposes, from an algal standpoint, identical to 150. It's, of course, a tiny bit higher, but it wouldn't make a difference on algal growth. So you're actually meeting the standards under the lower flow conditions when the algae are growing at a level that's far above the res criteria. And under the conditions that they're claiming violate the res criteria, I mean the high phosphorus concentrations happening at the higher flows, you're not getting a problem. Again, the system is performing exactly the opposite of what the res criteria assumed would occur. So it's clear that the conceptual framework that they used to develop the res criteria is inapplicable to the Minnesota River. I would likely reach the same conclusion that in any major agricultural area where you get elevated turbidity occurring at the same time, you're getting the increased runoff, which should be most agricultural areas, the res framework will also be inapplicable. The algal objective, for example, in the Minnesota River, is plainly unattainable at the res standard. If you meet 150 micrograms of phosphorus under a range of lower flow conditions, you're going to be over around 100 grams of chlorophyll A. The target that they were looking for long-term average is about 35. Now, whether or not 35 is met under average flow conditions is another interesting question. But clearly the entire premise of if I just get to 150 micrograms, all things will be improved in the Minnesota River and will meet standards is clearly incorrect. You could zero out the point sources and you would still have the same high algal levels. The only thing that could conceivably produce res criteria compliance, and when I mean res criteria, meaning achieving the 150 phosphorus, which the PCA claims constitutes res criteria compliance, would be extreme BMPs for all agricultural sources. And when I mean extreme, you more or less have to stop agriculture in the basin to prevent the runoff condition that they're saying exceeds the criteria. Obviously, that is not a reasonable answer. It would cause significant and widespread economic harm to force that to occur. And you still, again, even if you met the 150, would still not meet likely the chlorophyll A targets. So if you will, we've got a significant problem on our hands with the res criteria as they were adopted and as they're now being implemented. They're actually working to regulate the condition, the point sources more restrictively, in a manner that will not produce any meaningful change in, for example, the Minnesota River system. And if they actually tried to implement the standards as adopted, meaning you're going to have to force widespread hyper stringent BMPs to reduce agricultural phosphorus inputs, you wouldn't have any agriculture left. Clearly, we need to rethink this situation to figure out what will work out intelligently for this system and others.
Thank you, John. So now we're going to kind of pivot to what is the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities and MESERB doing about this. And I will just bring it back briefly to, we initially talked about the flawed scientific standards in regards to BOD and DO flux. And as I said, we have 2 lawsuits currently going at the federal and the state level. And I'm not going to spend any more time talking about that. I just wanted to mention it. In terms of this illegal implementation that we've really been spending the time about, what we have done so far is MESERB has sent a letter to the PCA requesting that it stop this implementation program, and we have not yet received a formal response from the PCA about how they are going to respond to the concerns that we have raised. I think based upon past experience, we're not hopeful that they will change what they are doing without significant political or potentially legal pressure from municipal entities through the CGMC and MESERB and elsewhere. What we are recommending is, as the PCA comes to your city or sanitary district or public utility commission and try to implement this standard in your permit, we want to ensure that you know that you have legal rights available to contest this. There are 2 cities thus far that have challenged permits based upon what the PCA is doing and the description that we have given, and that is the city of Glencoe and the Minnesota River Valley PUC, or the cities of LeSueur and Henderson. And we want to make sure that cities and permittees understand that you can challenge this. We've done a lot of the analysis at this point, so the way to challenge it is pretty efficient at this point. It's not going to cost you a lot of money, and it's something that if you don't challenge, you will be stuck with these more restrictive phosphorus limits that will have significant long-term impacts.
Yeah, one of the issues that people need to realize is that once an NPDES permit provision is established and you're meeting it, it's extremely difficult, if borderline impossible, to amend the permit to give you the right limit thereafter. There's an anti-backsliding provision that was adopted under the Federal Clean Water Act that pretty much, for all practical purposes, precludes you from amending a water quality-based limit, which is what this would be, for any water body that's considered impaired. So if you take the limit, and many cities, quite frankly, with some of these more restrictive limits, might, under their current flow conditions, be able to meet the limit. Of course, if they grow, they wouldn't. So, but if you currently can meet the limit, the anti-backsliding provision kicks in and you're stuck. So even if we later changed got the corrected res implementation by the PCA, you would not be able to get your permit modified. You would be stuck with it. So you either challenge it and block it from being implemented while the corrective action hopefully occurs at the state level, or, if you will, forever hold your peace and meet the limit. And that's the choice the law gives you.
And another significant point is that this not only affects the municipalities, but it also affects industries, and it particularly affects those SIUs, or significant industrial users, that contract with municipal facilities to treat their wastewater. Because if the municipal entity get a more restrictive limit, that will limit the growth of those industrial concerns in your communities, and the costs in many ways will be passed on to those and the ratepayers in your community. So it's not something to take lightly. And so there is an individual approach to this, and then we are also looking at a collective approach. And we can see this playing out potentially in 2 ways. One would be supporting a contested case challenge brought about from an individual permittee, most likely in the Minnesota River Basin, because what is happening there is particularly egregious. And so that would be one way. And if we get enough individual cities to challenge, we could potentially consolidate that challenge, which would be much more efficient for the individual permittees. And then secondly, there is a mechanism in Minnesota law by which we can directly challenge. The CGMC could directly challenge this res guidance, this res implementation procedure that is illegal, that did not go through notice and public comment rulemaking. If we could bring that challenge successfully, it would benefit every permittee in the state of Minnesota that discharges to a river, because we would be stopping this overly restrictive implementation. And there's a principle at play here as well, where the PCA needs to involve the public in these matters, especially when there is a significant financial and long-term social and economic impact. And to change a standard, to make it more restrictive after explaining it to the public one way and then changing it without going through the proper procedures, needs to be addressed as a matter of principle as well. And the benefits potentially, which we kind of talked about, could be, I mean, well, one, we're going to work to ensure that we're using those public expenditures in a meaningful way. We're going to prevent that illegal rule modification, protect future growth potential, and really the goal with this is to not file lawsuits. The goal is to get the PCA to the table, to work to develop a solution that is both cost effective and will actually address the health of the Minnesota River and the other river systems in the state, because we think, especially in the Minnesota River Basin, but what we have also seen in other river systems, that this implementation procedure and the standards themselves are not going to do that, and will lead to the inefficient use of these limited resources. And then in the Minnesota River Basin specifically, there has been a trading program which MESERB and John Hall and the law firm of Flaherty Hood and the city of Mankato helped to develop, and the res puts those trading programs at immediate risk and will abolish them essentially.
No, they would abolish the trading programs. And the disappointing thing, I'll just say from a personal perspective as to how the PCA has addressed this issue, is, nobody wants to come across as being anti-agriculture, okay? Because without agriculture, we wouldn't have our cities and you wouldn't be able to feed yourself. But the approach that they've used on the res, on focusing on point sources and giving them stringent limits, cuts off your opportunity to spend your money in a better way. I mean, really, the trading programs that we've gotten adopted in other states have also worked cooperatively with agricultural sources, so that you can take literally 10 cents on the dollar that you would have spent on removing the pollutants at the wastewater plant and put it into BMPs on some agricultural land that you get credit for. And by doing that, you actually produce far more benefit. You spend less money, produce more benefit, and you protect the agricultural resource of your area, which, by the way, is a valuable economic resource. So, this entire approach that just hammers municipalities into the ground and cuts off other better ways of doing things, it really needs to be rethought. There's a better way to make this system work.
And I think another point is that, and John can speak to this from experience, that I think, and John has talked about this, that over the years there has been a transition, it seems, at the PCA. There used to be a much more collaborative approach with public entities. And John, if you want to talk to that just briefly.
Almost certainly. I mean, and collaborative also with the environmental organizations, I might add. I mean, we had a series of regulatory updates that we did over the years, where we sat down to look at things that were unnecessarily stringent and wasting money, other things that updated science said should be more restrictive and was the better place to put the dollars. And those collaborative efforts led to a series of NPDES program and water quality standard changes. And it's unfortunate that, we had brought many of these issues on res implementation to the attention of the PCA, and they, for reasons I still don't understand, simply ignored them. But, in the end, when something's a scientific fact that it's not going to work, ignoring that conclusion doesn't make your position true. It just, give it a little more time and you'll be shown how foolish it is. Well, we're kind of at that point. And we're, again, just hopeful that we can get back to a more collaborative approach and just produce something that will be a better benefit to the environment, to the public, to agriculture, to everybody concerned in Minnesota.
So how can you support us? There's a couple of ways that I'm going to briefly talk about. So the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities the board of the coalition and its members, 80 cities in greater Minnesota, have established an environmental action fund. Now, CGMC members have already received information about how to contribute to this environmental action fund to really put forth a long-term comprehensive strategy, both legislatively, legally, and to some degree on the regulatory front, to address these issues going forward, address not only these phosphorus issues, but this regulatory tsunami coming at us. And so if you're a CGMC member, you have that information. If you have questions, please contact us. If you're not a CGMC member, if you're a city or another industrial entity and you would like to contribute to these efforts, you can do so. So please contact us and let us know. We're also asking non-CGMC members who will benefit from our efforts to participate by contributing to the Environmental Action Fund and potentially joining the CGMC. And then I'm also going to encourage you to join MESERB, which I'll talk about briefly. And then industrial and commercial partners can also contribute to the CGMC Environmental Action Fund. We need your support. If we do not address these issues, the problem will go unfixed. And this is not only, it's not about preventing standards, it's about making sure that the standards are cost effective and actually benefit water quality.
Now, let me make an observation, because we've done these collaborative coalition efforts in over a dozen states over the years. And my experience on it is as follows. When you get enough of the affected parties in the room insisting on a rational, reasonable, cost-effective approach, you get the attention of the agency you're dealing with, and as importantly, the political folks involved in the system. You're at that point right now. If you don't fix this, you're going to have a tremendous mess on your hands. I think if we can get the interest of all of those that are adversely affected by the misapplication of standards, insisting that we come up with something that really works, we'll get something that works. The groundswell produces results. So this is the time to get involved, and whether or not you decide to join as a member and do some of these other direct monetary contributions, or you just contact MESERB and others to say that you want to help and you want to be involved, both of those things are important.
Exactly. And I think it's important to note that we need your support both economically, but we need your support to bring forth a credible and political message as well. And so, like John said, it's not just about finances. There are other ways that cities can contribute. If you're not a member of the CGMC or MESERB, you can help us, you can sign letters, you can work with us. There are things that can be done. I think it's important to mention that the CGMC has a broad legal and legislative strategy, and the scope of this presentation is not to talk in detail about this as a public presentation, but if you are interested in participating and contributing, we will give you more of the details. And then the second piece of this is to really work with the Minnesota Environmental Science and Economic Review Board. If you are a municipal entity or an industrial entity, you can join MESERB. It's a joint powers organization, cities, sanitary districts, public utilities commissions, and then we have non-voting members that are industries, lots of engineering firms, other industries. And we really work at the PCA level on technical issues to work with the PCA to ensure that the standards that come out are scientifically sound and that they get implemented in a reasonable way. And it's really important that we have your support on the MESERB level on the regulatory side of things as well. So we would encourage you to join MESERB, and if you want information about how to join MESERB, please contact us. So now again, we are going into that question stage. And again, we would encourage you to ask questions. We will wait as they come in. It looks like we have a couple of questions that have already come in. Let me get to them here. All right, so we have one question that came in. Basically, it's asking, why did the MPCA procedures document never get reviewed by the public? And so this question is referring to, I'm assuming, the the guidance document that we were talking about that really amended the res criteria to apply more restrictive.
What was the date of that document, Dan? Do you recall?
I believe it was July 2015.
Okay.
This is an excellent question. I mean, I think there's a couple of points to make. I mean, one, because this document changes the standard significantly, the law requires that they would seek public comment and go through some rulemaking procedures. I know that John has made comments in the past that, for 20 years working in Minnesota, he hasn't really seen where a guidance document that is this significant hasn't gone through notice and public comment rule.
No, and as a matter of fact, the res criteria development documents themselves were repeatedly sent out to all the stakeholders to give an opportunity to review and provide input. I mean, I do understand that this res document actually got sent out to EPA for input, and I believe MCEA, the environmental organizations, were involved in and providing comments on it. How it was that the municipal and other commercial and agricultural components did not get a chance to look at this document while others were given is, I guess in a word, kind of inexcusable. But, we are where we are right now, and it's the document they've created. Obviously, we need to weigh in on it now.
And there is evidence to suggest that some of the environmental advocacy organizations, both at the federal level through EPA Region 5 and the PCA, did have some input potentially with PCA, but it's, the regulated community, the public on this issue, on the guidance document specifically, there really wasn't an opportunity to comment.
Cut out the people most affected by the document were cut out. That's
okay.
Not good.
We have a couple of other questions here. One, has MESERB or the CGMC asked the MPCA for an explanation of how they determined to use DO flux for the res, and if so, what was their explanation? John, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I was involved in the detailed review of the criteria when they were first proposed, and when I saw the BOD number, if you will, my jaw dropped, because having been involved in nutrient criteria development in at least 24 states at this point, no one had ever used BOD. What happened was they took BOD measurements in the stream, when there was algae growing. They ran those BOD tests. By the way, the BOD tests are run in the dark. So if you take live algae and you put them in a BOD bottle and then you put them in the dark for 5 days, they all die. And they produce a BOD that does not actually exist in the environment. BOD is caused by carbonaceous material and also nitrogenous. And when it gets oxidized, it consumes oxygen. Well, if you put it's like if you threw a tarp over your front lawn, you know what it would look like 5 days later. Not good. It would be dying. So they took the test, used live algae, put them in the dark, and then took those test results and plotted it versus some information they had on, I think it was darters in a few of these streams, and then simply said, look, when we have higher BOD, apparently we have less darters. I asked the question of, do you know how many darters you're supposed to have in a stream? Answer, no. I said, well, how do you know what any of this means? And oh, by the way, that BOD did not actually occur in that stream. Live algae don't produce that result. And we just, if you will, got blown off. They then said that BOD level is what they're using to pick the algal level. And then they somehow related it to a DO flux level, which was still to this day, I've looked at it, I still don't know how they really did it. And so that was the daisy chain, if you will. Everything originated out of a BOD test that actually wasn't what could even possibly occur in the environment. It was not a real BOD. That, by the way, is why Standard Methods got involved. when Standard Methods understood that the PCA took, and EPA, in fact, supported them, taking a BOD test and trying to correlate BOD to an animal impact, to an aquatic life impact, they said that's completely wrong. The test does not do that. It's like somebody telling you, I'm taking your fingerprint and I'm going to use it to tell you how tall you are. It's like, really? You know, fingerprints are good for identifying people. They're not good for telling you how tall you are. So you can't use the test for that basis. Standard Methods told them it was wrong, and even that got ignored. So at this point, we're a little flabbergasted as to the scientific basis and or reason. I mean, quite frankly, if you want to regulate nutrients for causing algal growth, measure the amount of algae that are in the system. You don't need the BOD. You don't need the DO flux. You just measure the algae. That's what they did for the lake standard, and that's what we asked them to do in this case.
And I think the short answer is, did they, how they determined to use DO flux, and the response that they gave us is, I think that there was a lot of, and this is, street parlance, but chucking and jiving.
Yeah, well, if they go measure a DO flux, they're now going to start putting data sondes out in rivers, and a data sonde is a 24-hour round-the-clock mechanical device that allows you to measure how DO goes up and down. It can also measure other parameters too. They're going to put that in streams, and when they measure a DO flux going higher than the amount they said was required to protect fish, they're going to declare your stream nutrient impaired, even though there's not a scientific document I'm aware of. And I worked on the DO criteria document update when I was at EPA. There's not a document I know of that says a DO flux adversely impacts aquatic life, let alone the DO fluxes that they picked.
And then we have another question here, which is presenting a legitimate critique of the presentation, and I'll read it. It says, I understand that city administrators were invited to listen to this webinar, but quite frankly, a lot of the terms and acronyms that are being discussed are over my head. I'm trying to keep from nodding off. Is ultimately the goal of this presentation to tell us you'll be fighting for our rights, prevent us from going bankrupt due to scientifically misled mandates? And I think that there's a lot of complicated information in this presentation. It was sent to a broad audience targeting technical people, local politicians, etc. And so I think your critique is valid, but I think you're right that the point of this presentation, and we wanted to give as much detail as possible to really explain the issues, is that, yeah, we are fighting for your rights, and we are going to work to prevent that your limited resources are allocated efficiently to address these environmental concerns.
Yeah, I'd have to say that since I've been doing this for 35 years now, the problem always is that the science is complicated. The bottom line, however, is that there's huge economic effect from just some nuances on these scientific issues. Often people get criticized if they're just saying, it's a lot of dollars, why are you making me spend that? I mean, really, if you're causing a problem, they can make you spend a lot of money. If you're not causing a problem, which is what the science will tell you one direction or another, then you are validly raising an objection as to the benefits and need for the expenditure. So I have to apologize for having to go through all the science, but without it, you really can't make a credible case that somebody's misallocating your resource. And we'll try to maybe in the future do this in a two-part approach where we can just get to some of the bottom lines. And then for those that would like to listen to the details, they'll get more. But in the end, you really do need to do both.
And okay, so thank you for that question and constructive criticism. The next question that we have is, so what can cities do to protect themselves if they get a more restrictive phosphorus permit? And I'll take a stab at that one, and then John, please chime in. So as we alluded to earlier, there have been several cities that have gotten permits based upon these river standards. and the illegal implementation strategy that the PCA is doing. And there is a process in law. Cities have a legal right to challenge these permits during that notice and public comment period. So there's a 30-day notice and public comment period. And to challenge a permit to prevent it from taking legal effect, you have to file what's called a contested case petition within that 30-day period. And now we have done that for 2 cities on this specific issue at this point. And there is a fairly uniform analysis that plays out. And so if you get one of these permits and you are concerned about the impacts for your city and for the other communities around you and for the long-term impact on the environment, as you should be, you should contact us, reach out to MESERB and the coalition, and we can help you address those issues.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, some of the issues are so obvious and generic that really the write-up that's been done for others would require the most minor of changes to be applied to other cities. So the documentation is available. You just need to make sure it gets filed at the right time, because if you miss the comment period or miss your opportunity to request for a contested case, you can be pretty sure they're not going to give you a favorable answer on the comment, and you're going to get the permit as it was drafted. And that would not be a good outcome.
All right, I am not seeing any other additional questions at this point, so I wanted to just take the opportunity to thank everybody for participating today and taking the time to review this presentation. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to email me at Daniel Marx, DMMARX at Flaherty-Hood.com, and I will follow up with you directly in due time. So thank you very much, and until next time.